The title of today's seminar is Risk Management in Development Cooperation, the challenge to simultaneously act responsibly and responsively. My name is Johan Schar. I'm the Deputy Chair of the Expert Group for Aid Studies, EBA. And as usual, when we open our seminars, many of you have heard this introduction already, but just a few words about who are we. So the Expert Group for Aid Studies is a government committee, 10 members appointed by the government, tasked to review and evaluate Swedish development cooperation and humanitarian assistance with the purpose of contributing to its long-term development and improvement. We are supported by a very qualified secretariat of 6 staff who are permanent staff of the committee. We like to talk about our work as exercising dual or double independence, meaning that the committee, although the members have been appointed by the government, we independently decide on what evaluations and studies and so on to undertake. And the other part of the independence is that the authors of reports and evaluations that we commission are independently responsible for what they have produced. Of course, their reports will have been approved by the committee if they are released, but the authors are responsible for what they have presented. We present our conclusions in an annual report, the annual EBA aid review, which is presented to the government in March every year. There are copies of the most recent one outside of this room. And of course, the purpose of our work is also to do our work in such a way that we help build bridges between research, policymakers, and other practitioners and researchers in the sphere of development cooperation and humanitarian affairs. So today we have a very interesting and timely report which is trying to address and help us understand what it's like to simultaneously take risks, work flexibly in very complex and conflictual environments, in fragile environments, while also being fully accountable, of course, ultimately accountable for the taxpayers' money that are being used by aid agencies. The report, Fit for Fragility, an exploration of risk stakeholders and systems inside Sida, so there's a focus on Sida here, has been written by 2 distinguished authors, Nilima Gulrajani and Linnea Mills, who will soon make the presentation. And just a few words in terms of introducing them. Nilima is a senior research fellow at the Overseas Development Institute in London, ODI. She is also an associate at the Department for International Development at King's College in London. And she has a background also at the London School of Economics and has specialized in her work on complex problems experienced within organizations and in dealing with organizational effectiveness in international development. Her co-author, Linnea Mills, who happens to be a Swedish national, I think still, yes, she's an independent research consultant who has worked extensively in analysis of international development, and her PhD, also from LSE, focused on the anti-corruption agenda of donors and how it is being practiced in sub-Saharan Africa. So this is where we are. Their work has been supported by a reference group, an EBA reference group, of which I have been the chair, who have worked with them throughout this period in providing support, guidance as a sounding board and so on and so forth. But ultimately, the authors are in charge of presenting and being responsible for what they have produced. This event is being live streamed, so if anyone wants to sort of adapt to that or make sure that you behave, please consider this fact that we are being watched. And also, if you would like to say something about this event on social media, please tag EBA committee. And having said that, I'd like to give the floor to Nilima and Linnea, please.
My name is Nilima Gulrajani. Thank you very much for the opportunity to be here and present the results of a study that has now been about 1.5 years in the making. I'm the lead author on the study, and Linnea and I have worked closely throughout that period to come up with findings that hopefully resonate with most of you, but also perhaps challenge many of you as well. Just before I start, like to thank both the EBA committee for hosting the seminar and supporting the study and providing an opportunity to work on a fascinating topic. And also to thank all of those individuals who spoke with us and took the time really to engage with the work and review the work. I have about 25 minutes or so. I might push the limit of 25 minutes, and Linnea will come in the middle to present the paper. But essentially, in terms of the structure of the next half an hour or so, I'm going to start with 1 and 2, which is really presenting the rationale of the study, the theoretical framework, and the research questions that motivated this work. Linnea will come in and then talk about methods. So that's sort of the preamble of the study. And then we'll get into some of the key topics in the actual report, which is number 4, an exploration of Swedish risk attitudes and preferences through both a kind of qualitative and quantitative analysis. Look specifically at Sida in terms of who the risk stakeholders for Sida are and the risk management systems that exist there. Think a bit about how, within the various risk spheres that are faced in fragile states, how Sida is seeking to maintain both accountability and flexibility in those engagements. And then lastly, conclude with some attempt to make some suggestions for how risk management can be made fitter. So to jump right in, I'll start with the rationale for this study. I think Sweden is not alone in having a growing interest in the challenges faced in fragile and conflict-affected states. All bilateral development agencies are channeling an increasing amount of funding and support to these group of states. There's been a 30% increase, or $16 billion increase between 2007 and 2016. It's widely acknowledged that extreme poverty is increasingly concentrated in these states, and that these countries are stuck due to systematic political, economic challenges. For development agencies, this is now becoming a core part of the work they're doing. And there's no doubt that these agencies need to adapt to focus on these groups of countries. And I don't think we're in an era now where this concern can be sidelined into a humanitarian box. I think that humanitarian development nexus and the need for collaboration is real. Simultaneous to this growing kind of attention on fragile states is an emerging and growing consensus around a paradigm for how to work in these states. And I think many of you might know about the adaptive management movement. What you might not know is that movement has a much longer history in public management theory, which is the background that I come to the study with. The embrace of contingency, so placing the premium on contextual factors for organizational life, attention, and behavior. This argument that no grand theory is possible, that we need to appreciate context and ability to adapt to local environments, and a commitment to be flexible in the face of changing circumstances. And this is now known to be linked to the adaptive management movement, where outcomes are generated through an iterative process of adaptation, continuous learning, with no prefix solutions in place. And I think the new deal of engagement for engagement in fragile states really encapsulates some of these ideas, which is effectively a kind of global consensus on how donor agencies should be engaging. Values like collaboration and mutual trust are at the heart of that consensus. So growing interest in fragile states and a growing kind of consensus around the way donors should be behaving or engaging with such states. At the same time, there's an acknowledged elevation in the risks that are faced within these states. And the OECD in 2014 came up with this typology of those risks, broadly framing them into contextual risks, programmatic risks, and institutional risks. So contextual risks are the risks that in some sense lie beyond the donor's control. They are issues like a breakdown of a political settlement, deterioration of community relations, the onset of violence. These outcomes, as I said, lie beyond, for the most part, the agency. Programmatic risks are really risks that are more in a donor's control, and they can derive from things like weak program design, flawed assessments from the field, or operational mismanagement. And lastly, institutional risks are really risks which are seen to have, donors are seen to have higher control over. They have internal consequences for a donor, an implementing organization, or staff, and can potentially create severe reputational damage. So examples could be, for example, security risks, fiduciary risks, legal risks relating to compliance with international treaties and laws. And these risks are interdependent. They're not separate spheres. There's an interdependency between them. And I think the literature suggests these risks exist, they can be classified as such, and that they're elevated in fragile states. But I think there's also an acknowledgement in both the policy literature and the academic literature that donor risk appetite remains constrained vis-a-vis these elevated risks. More generally, beyond even the fragile states setting, donors have tended to not embrace uncertainty. The backdrop for this are failing public legitimacy for the effectiveness of aid spending, the demands of greater public scrutiny, conservative risk cultures inside donor agencies. These agencies also have strong responsibility for risk control towards their stakeholders, and showing this accountability is really giving them, agencies a license to act. And risk management essentially becomes a bit of a visible display of the public sector, whether a development agency or any public sector agency, a display of their accountability for the responsibilities delegated to it by citizens. And this can, but not necessarily does, lead to an overemphasis on internal culture, on internal controls, auditing, and blame avoidance. So I think that the critical question is really, how can donors be both accountable for the risks that they're running in fragile states for the purpose of this study, and still entertain the values of flexibility, trust, and continuous adaptation that are at the heart of new ways of working in fragile states? In terms of a theoretical framework, I'd like to present the yin and yang, which is often thought of opposites or contrary forces that are yet seen to be complementary, interconnected, and interdependent. And I think we can think about accountability and flexibility dilemmas in public management as a bit of a yin and yang tension. The imperatives of both of these are fundamental to all areas of public life. You know, for flexibility, public managers must operate in networked, decentralized manners to address some of the most challenging problems that society faces, whether that's domestic or international. And yet that flexibility can challenge structures and procedures that have traditionally legitimated the expenditure of public funds or the exercise of public sector authority. So flexibility can create a degree of discomfort with risks that are run. And on the accountability side, if flexibility is becoming essential, the public is not necessarily willing to forsake accountability to achieve flexibility. Citizens are demanding accountability for states' delegated powers, the use of taxpayer funds, desire for openness, transparency, and scrutiny. So the modern management dilemma, if you will, is really finding forms of accountability that allow for flexibility of action, and similarly ensuring that flexible action is responsible, accountable action. And the need to grapple with both these tendencies is fundamental to the kind of modern manager's task, that you cannot separate these two tasks in practice, and they have to grapple with this duality. And while they lie in productive tension, they don't necessarily have to be traded off. So I guess the question here is, how does Sida deal with this tension? How does it balance the imperative of responsibility against a desire for responsiveness? That is the broad parameter for this study. And here we just have a quick quote from the OECD: flexibility is essential to successful risk management. Now here, I think this is an interesting quote because it suggests there is potentially little trade-off. And I wanted to state that, our approach to this study was not a rationalist approach to risk-taking. It is a cultural approach to risk-taking, to suggest that the ability to act flexibly is really something that is socially created. It's mediated by attitudes to risks, expectations, both within the organization in question, but within the authorizing space writ large, and people's perceptions. And so flexibility is sort of very much derivative of the risk culture that exists in an organization. And that is the backdrop. And the backdrop for that culture is really the broader authorizing environment, which I think Linnea will present briefly. So the question is really, can risk management create a positive risk culture that can enable the flexibility that the OECD says is essential to successful risk management? So in terms of the questions that we're asking, the first question takes a broader kind of view of the Swedish environment, asking about risk attitudes and preferences in the context of its fragile states engagement. We conclude that that environment has enlarged. And again, Linnea will talk more about that. In the second question, we sort of try and nail down the stakeholders and the risk management systems that currently govern and operate in Sida. And essentially on that score, we suggest that flexible risk management has become a reality in Sida. Question 3 looks at the way the practice of that risk management is managing these dual trends towards accountability and flexibility. And here, we see greater willingness to embrace flexibility towards certain kinds of risks over others. And then lastly, we conclude with some recommendations for taking forward a fitter or a better approach to risk management. So I will transfer now to Linnea.
Thank you very much, Nilima. Thank you. Yes, hello everyone. Thank you very much for coming. I hope you can hear me. Yes, I will talk a little bit about methods first, and then we go into answering the research questions. So this study is anchored in an interpretive, qualitative, mixed methods approach. And as Nilima said earlier, we understand the world of risk as socially and historically constructed by norms, patterns of behavior, and social interactions. And we explore these perceptions of people in Sida and other parts of the Swedish aid system through 3-stage process. The first stage involved scoping interviews, and we interviewed a number of people in different parts of Sida, but also in other organizations or other agencies, such as Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Folke Bernadotte Academy and Riksrevisionen. So we used a carefully selected number of people with lived experiences in these questions. The second stage consisted of 3 focus group discussions that took place here in Stockholm August last year. There were 3 stakeholder groups that we discussed with, or that shared their experiences with the risk management, mainly from the fields in fragile states. And that was, the first group was head of development cooperation based in Swedish embassies in fragile states. The second group consisted of Sida staff with control functions. And then the third group was Swedish non-governmental organizations that Sida has framework agreements with and that operate in fragile states. So these interviewees and focus group participants, they shared with us their information about the systems in Sida. They described the systems for us and the processes involved, but they also offered their opinions about systems and their reflection about. So that is what we have tried to capture in this study and draw conclusions from. The third stage of the research process focused on contextualizing our analysis. And we used two ways of doing that. The first one was to look closely at one contribution, Sida contribution, and that was a contribution about sexual and reproductive health in Afghanistan. And then we also did a light touch comparison between Sida and development cooperation agencies in the UK, Norway, and United States. So our first research question, we asked, what are Swedish risk attitudes and preferences in the context of its fragile states engagements? And we approached this research question from two angles. The first looked at the question of, from a political perspective and focusing on the Swedish political authorizing environment for risk. And the second one looked at aid statistics and see if there was anything that we could judge from the portfolio of Swedish aid. So just, no, sorry, that one. Yes. So what do I mean by political authorizing environment? Development agencies respond to their authorizing environment, which is a collection of actors to whom the organization is accountable. And we suggest that, that the authorizing environment for risk-taking in Sweden has enlarged from 2000 forward or so onwards, at least until the end of this study period, which was 2018. So in the period of between 2006 and 2014, it was alluded to us from interviews and other material that it was a heightened focus on a strong regulatory and fiduciary controls in the public sector overall in Sweden. And there was a lack of trust and limited room for professional discretion. But from 2014 onwards, we see a shift in this political authorizing environment in general, away from regulatory control mindset to one that seeks to foster trust in public servants and service, and which can be seen from initiatives like Tillitsdelegationen. And we argue that this represents a more tolerant attitude to risk than there was in the past. I have a little quote that also highlight this tolerant of risk from the 2016 policy framework for Swedish development cooperation, which states risk-taking is often essential in development cooperation is to achieve results. Risk must be weighed against the result in terms of poverty reduction and sustainable development that can potentially be achieved. Supporting an initiative may therefore sometimes be justified even if risks are high. This requires good risk management and developing forms of risk sharing. So that was from 2016, which highlighted maybe this shift. So if the institutional, organizational, political environment in Sweden now embraces a more tolerant attitude to risk, what can we see from a portfolio analysis of Swedish aid? Actually, the opposite, I would say, judging from this graph and a few other graphs that we have in the report. There seem to be an untapped opportunities to capitalize on this more high risk appetite authorizing environment. For example, this figure here illustrates that Sweden channels a large and an increasing part of its aid to international government, international organization, multilateral organization, and international NGOs, and that is and then a shrinking space to Swedish organizations and organizations in partner countries, and it suggests then that it's suggestive of a risk aversion, that Sida outsources its risk to other organizations. It might also be suggestive of a lack of capacity in Sida, that it outsources its administrative capacities. And there are different ways to interpret this data, but they are not suggestive of taking opportunities that are given in the more risk tolerant or higher risk approach, risk appetite that seem to come from the wider political environment. So the second research question, we look at Sida's approach to risk and risk management. And first of all, we identified Sida's risk stakeholders as being international bodies, political actors, including parliament, ministries, especially the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, regulators, including Riksrevisionen, civil society experts in the media, and the Swedish public. And we found from interviews that a more conducive political authorizing environment has allowed for and embedded a more flexible risk management approach system in Sida. And in the minds of staff, this was mostly exemplified by a change to the way Sida the formal system for documenting, weighing, and assessing risk in Sida, which is done through track. The first track, there are two tracks. First track is from 2012 to 2018. Second track was launched in March 2018, and that's where we came into the study. The first one was developed as part of an attempt to regain confidence in Sida, following a lot of criticism from its political authorizing environment and risk stakeholders. It was a way to regain confidence and legitimacy. And it ended up being heavy as a violation of track from 2016 states a checklist and support to ensure compliance. So it was in that defensive mode it was constructed. The second track, as I said, was launched in March 2018. And this is much more conducive for a flexible approach. In the new track, there's space for staff to assess risk in a few thematic areas that are relevant to a contribution. And there's focus of learning and adapting rather than compliance, audit, and box ticking. And the new system puts higher trust in staff to prioritize, mitigate, and justify risk and decide when risks are material to results. It was not a lot of resistance to the new system. So it suggests that this increased flexibility and risk appetite is now socially and culturally embedded in Sida. So I'm going to end with a quote that I think highlights this shift very much. I read, "A couple of years ago, I had the feeling that it was lip service, that we were supposed to be brave and take risks. I think there was a concern about financial management and whether we would be able to defend decisions publicly. But I think these days the risk appetite is greater, and it's said by Sida's management with more confidence. I certainly feel empowered to take risks these days, so there is substantial risk appetite." And that was a quote from a head of development cooperation in a fragile state. I give Nilima back to you. Mm-hmm.
Great. So in our third research question, we really wanted to ask this question: to what extent is this flexible risk management system that seems to be emerging, balancing the two imperatives of accountability and flexibility? And recall I had said earlier that these imperatives are really fundamental to all arenas of public organization, and that they can't really be separated in practice. And so the question was, how does Sida deal with that tension? How does it balance the imperative of responsibility against the desire for responsiveness in each of the risk spheres that are elevated in fragile states: institutional risk, contextual risk, and programmatic risk? And the impression we were left with in terms of our interviewee focus groups and the contribution that we looked at in Afghanistan was there seems to be greater flexibility extended towards programmatic and contextual risk. So essentially that flexibility, greater flexibility is possible vis-a-vis those risks, but that in the context of the institutional risks, there seems to be less willingness to be flexible, that the accountability imperative was very strong. So just to kind of illustrate this a little bit from the contribution that we looked at in Afghanistan. So Afghanistan, as many of you probably already know, there's been a long-standing Swedish commitment to the country. It's a top recipient of Swedish aid that has grown to a peak of 132 US million in 2014, and Sweden is the 5th largest donor. It's also a long-term donor, so the Swedish Committee for Afghanistan has been active for the last 35 years there, when many donors abandoned Afghanistan, largely focused on social sector spending. And Sweden has a 5-year strategy there, so there's a kind of vision beyond the annual one. The context for Afghanistan is relatively it is risk-rich, and in the strategy that's stipulated an awareness of these risks, but nonetheless a desire to engage. In terms of the actual contribution we were looking at, in this context, we were looking at a sexual and reproductive health and rights contribution. The implementing partner was Marie Stopes International Afghanistan, and the aim of this contribution was to strengthen access to health information, improve the affordability of care and quality of service extended to women. And the contribution has been a long-standing one. It's been operating since 2008 in 3 phases, and the 4th phase started last year. The investment has grown progressively from a little less than US 1 million initially to 4.5 million in its 4th phase. And Sida is the largest donor in this contribution with 71% of the total. Its scope started relatively narrowly on maternal and child health in the northern regions, and it has evolved to include men in advocacy and awareness raising, the provision of direct reproductive services, and its 4th phase has also expanded into areas of Afghanistan dominated by insurgency groups. So what I'm going to try and do is illustrate very quickly this argument that I think certain risks are easier to be more flexible about or to kind of accept, as opposed to some other kinds of risks that seem to be less acceptable, with some flavor of the results from Afghanistan. So essentially what we seem to be seeing is that flexible risk management is not enabling unfettered flexibility. It's easier in certain risk areas and creating this bifurcation between acceptable and less acceptable. So in terms of programmatic risks, now these are the risks that derive from program design. There seems to be a willingness to entertain programmatic risks. The risk is acknowledged, but there is high value seen in these opportunities. Staff are increasingly willing to accept risks of failure and recognize the risks of non-engagement and not achieving results. So this particular contribution was an ambitious, one might even say audacious attempt to tackle a taboo subject in a conservative Muslim society, done by gradually building trust in the partner, implementing, and it took considerable risk in programming. For example, engaging mullahs' wives to spread change and reduce some of the taboo around discussing sexual and reproductive health. In terms of contextual risks, staff on the ground seem to have greater space to decide on those risks. There was greater flexibility here. So notwithstanding a worsening security situation, there was still a desire to engage, and that engagement seems to have paid off publicly as the Afghanistan government publicly supported the use of contraception and addressing unmet reproductive needs, which was a pleasant surprise for many Sida staff. And lastly, in terms of institutional risk, what we see is that these risks, there seems to be the dominance of accountability. And I'll talk about 2 examples. One was the fiduciary risk. So there's a sense that fiduciary risk, or the risk of corruption, is essentially the elephant in the room. That a never accept approach to corruption really has to be squared against the desire for greater risk-taking in fragile states. So with corruption risks in Afghanistan very high, this was interpreted as a reason why the Kabul office lacked full financial delegated authorities compared to other missions. And that was potentially seen to disempower local decision-making. And this was potentially compounded by the controller function still be located in Stockholm due to elevated security risks. In terms of security risks, there was also some reluctance to embrace these. So Sida has a very strong duty of care for its expatriate staff, and this to some degree is extended to local staff, but with some provisions around mobility that seem to be different. Sida staff take this obligation quite seriously. They're seen to have a moral obligation to local staff that weighs heavily on their minds. The accountability for their security and safety. And I think there might be opportunity to think through how to balance that with the need to be more flexible, for example, to travel to different regions, given these staff have very unique cultural and linguistic skills that can be very useful in the context of Sida's ambitions in Afghanistan. So essentially, I want to leave you with, I guess, a bit of a metaphor of candlesticks. It's maybe a good one in Sweden. On the left-hand side, we see sort of two distinct candlesticks. And I'd like to sort of, in your mind, think about one is accountability and one is flexibility. The accountability stick, I would argue, seems to burn the flame of institutional risk. Accountability is a bedrock in institutional risk. The flexibility pillar, we think, is more of a foundation in what we've seen for contextual risk and programmatic risk. So there is separation in these flames. There's a balance but separation that's creating this segmentation between acceptable and less acceptable risks. Accountability and flexibility service different risk spheres. And where we're trying to get Sida to move potentially or to reflect on is whether we can achieve better reconciliation between accountability and flexibility in each of the risk spheres. So the candles on the right have effectively, they're one candlestick with two flames. And we think that might be a model for what we mean by each candlestick representing one risk area, which has both accountability and flexibility as pillars. So, our solutions then, or the recommendations that we come up with, is that risk management systems need to be accountable for the risks that they run, that this can allow Sida to buffer itself against potential future changes in its authorizing environment when such risks might become less tolerable, but that also there's greater need to think about flexibility towards the institutional risks that maximize the potential for success in fragile states programming. This requires cultivating the support of risk stakeholders, giving Street a strong sense of accountability for staff safety and the use of taxpayer funds. How much time do I have left? 1 minute, 2 minutes. Okay, so I was almost sure I was going to run out of time, but let me just quickly try and give you a quick flavor of what solutions we were thinking about. But basically, we thought in terms of strengthening accountability for risk-taking, our recommendation is perhaps encouraging a guidance note for staff to be able to think about what informed decision-making would look like in practice. So many staff spoke of the importance of informed decision-making, but no real framework for understanding what the burden of proof was, how much evidence was required, what was the organizational standard relating to the burden of proof that might help those individuals in Sida who are increasingly taking responsibility for the risk runs. And this could create some standard for how good is good enough in terms of defending the decisions you're taking if risks were ever to materialize. The second was a risk communication strategy. So here we thought maybe a public statement on risk appetite, communicating to the external public. If the guidance note was more internal, risk communications was a more external focus. All we could see in terms of an external communication seemed to be the policy framework for 2016. Beyond this, it wasn't clear how Sida was communicating the flexibility that it now had. And I think there's an opportunity to create a public narrative around risk that admits the possibility of failure, but also acknowledges the ambitiousness and, dare I say, the audaciousness of its work in some states. And you can look to some of the communications efforts in the US when NASA launched a man on the moon for some examples of that. And we think this could introduce more accountability for the flexibility that Sida has, and basically prep Sida's authorizing environment to ensure it can continue to champion flexibility. And just lastly, in terms of strengthening flexibility for risk-taking, here we thought there were three potential options. One is to encourage greater risks of the trade-offs involved. So if you're going to have a very conservative approach to fiduciary risk, what's being lost? And there could be a possibility for thinking about the what are we losing by having very strong standards? And there are no easy answers. It's very hard to be flexible towards institutional risks. But clearly there's a need to reflect on the trade-offs and create incentives for such reflections to avoid entrenched risk avoidance, to more informed risk-taking. Nuancing never accept approaches to corruption. So we know that all donors face this problem. Question is how much risk is tolerable. And I think the authorizing environment in Sida is currently strong enough to encourage such a reflection on whether a never accept approach is the direction that it wants to head, because there is a potential problem of mixed messaging given the risks elevated in these contexts. And lastly, risk is a living subject matter. So here, I think there needs more conversation on risk and feedback on the practice of risk management itself. And this can encourage dialogue and discussion around the appropriate balance between accountability and flexibility, taking risk management out of the silo of administrative process, inculcating into broader work cultures. So I will leave it there. Look forward to the dialogue and the comments.
Yes, thank you very much, Nilima and Linnea. I was advised that I was too loud before. Is this more, doesn't hurt your ears too much? Is this okay? Yeah, people are nodding. So thank you very much. We now have a distinguished panel to give their comments and takeaways from this presentation. And I'll ask all three of you, Magnus, Hans, and Kajsa, to come up to the two tables here. So our panelists are Hans Magnusson, who is currently the head of the Africa department at Sida, with a background of working at headquarters level and in the field in some of these very fragile and difficult environments, most recently as head of cooperation in Guatemala. Kajsa is formerly a field staff for the Swedish Committee for Afghanistan, now on the board of the Swedish Committee, and is working at the moment for We Effect, but also you're also doing your PhD studies in Växjö on Mozambique. Yes. And then finally we have Magnus Lindell, who has held a number of senior positions at Sida. Left, I think, around 2011 or so, then worked in Palestine for the UN Agency for Palestinian Refugees, came back to Sweden and has worked for the past few years for the National Audit Office as head of their international programs. And he's also a newly appointed member of the Expert Group for AIDS Studies. So I'll begin with Hans. I think what Linnea and Nilima are describing here is very much sort of your daily reality. This is what you are dealing with on a daily basis. So all this, the range of risks, the institutional, the contextual, the programmatic risks. So what have you picked up? What are your takeaways from the report?
Well, thank you. Well, I think first of all, I just like to say that I think that the picture you describe is very accurate. I think that there is an increased risk appetite now in Sida, and I think it's a cultural move beyond just sort of words. But of course, it's also rather recent. If you look upon a decentralized organization, big organization, at least I think it's rather big. So I would say that even though this is a movement towards risk appetite, I think it varies a lot between different offices out of the 35, 40 offices we have. And I also think, and maybe you mentioned the shifting of inter-organizational relationships between controllers, decision makers, and program officers. And I think that change is still going on. And as we all know, when we have to change our ways of working, it's sort of difficult just to change it. But that's still sort of part of that variety in how risk appetite is expressed. And I think also that when you talk about the tension between programmatic and institutional risk, specifically fiduciary risk, I think that it's really true. We have sort of that tension, we live with it. But I would like to sort of maybe just sort of I think that we have sort of a way of working with corruption that maybe is a bit different. And I think that we are fully aware that there is corruption in all the places where we work. And I think that we have realized that it's not possible to avoid entering into a situation where there is a risk for corruption. But I think that what we see is that if we find corruption, we should act right away. And of course, and we also internally, it's sort of those teams or sections, the cooperation sections that does not or do not find have corruption cases. We ask ourselves, so aren't you follow up what you're doing? You should have some corruption cases. So I think that yesterday we had actually sort of gave an award, which is sort of a gold spade to the person in the office that have actually found most corruption cases. Which is sort of premiate. It's really good to find them because we know they are there and we need to find them and act on them. And at the same time, every time you find a corruption case, it's a lot of work to deal with that. So it creates an aversion from entering into the situations where you might find a lot of them. And I also would like just to comment your I think that you have the recommendations that you make in the in your study are really good. I think that yes, we need to communicate on both internally and externally on the risk and flexibility, and I think that that's really important. I think it would be really difficult to create a standard of informed risk taking. I understand the value of it, but I think that just creating it would be a risky business. So I think that sort of it will be difficult, and it might be that you need to, when you do that, you maybe need to be have less risk appetite than you really want to have. So I think it might be tricky. I think you're really right. We need to discuss these issues all the time, and it should be sort of a really living concept. And when you talk about the risk and opportunities, I think that my experience is that in the thematic or geographic areas where we actually have good results that we can show, we are normally have higher risk appetite. So I think there is sort of a really needed to be worked there, and to highlight the good results you can get when you take risks. One thing that I think is maybe not so much touched upon, or a more difficult issue which relates to political risks, that actually cuts across all the three: programmatic, institutional, and whatever. And I think those political risks are sort of very rarely expressed out. And
You mean political risks in Sweden, the Swedish
no,
environment, or in the...
it could be, especially when we talk about fragile states.
Yeah.
We work in triple nexus. We work with the peace, humanitarian assistance, and development. Peace is very close linked to security. We enter into areas which are really politically very difficult. It could be risks for Swedish reputation in the country. It could be risks that has to do with possibilities to do anything, because there are political risks in it. So they touch upon a lot of different areas at the same time. And we very seldom manage to make them explicit. So they become more like sort of a, how do you say it, self-censorship, more than risk management. And then one thing that you have in your book, and I think it's really good, that you mention new ways of working with development. And I think that what we really need to learn and work more with is actually working incrementally. That is a very, very good way of trying to reduce the risks and at the same time being very, very flexible. And I think that's one thing that we really need to look upon more.
Thank you, Hans. I think we'll stop there. You've touched on a number of issues that I think we may want to come back with. Interesting, you say one should avoid putting on paper, documenting what is the standard internally. So let's remember that one. Kajsa, in your role in the past and now, I think you've been sort of on the receiving end, if you like, on Sida's risk management practices. What are your comments and takeaways?
Yes, I have some thoughts. They're both related to my past assignments, but probably also, like, being a PhD student, you're very much also into the methods and discussing like thinking about the scope and the limitation. So one thing that I reflected upon quite early in the study was how like the risk stakeholders, like the title says, it's about the systems within Sida, but it's also about the risk stakeholders. And I find that, and also in your presentation on the empirical material, it's very Sweden-centered and very donor-centered. So it would be interesting just to hear from you how you thought about that, and like the claims that we can make about this topic when we exclude like all the receiving ends. I mean, you have a focus group with the Swedish NGOs, but there is no one in the study that is actually from a receiving country. Then I was also wondering a bit about, and it would be interesting to hear, I mean, it's about risk and it's about the fragile states and environment. So it would also be interesting, like, looking at the portfolio of Swedish Development Cooperation, all of the countries, I would say, or most of them, are in some kind of, like, on a continuum of fragility. There will be very few countries where Sweden operates that are fully stable and not at all fragile. And especially if we look at like a bit of a longer time span. So what would have been the implication for your conclusions if we would have like excluded this in the fragile environments, just looking at risk taking in Swedish Development Cooperation? I mean, you could also put it like, what is the added value of like framing it in like the fragile environments and states? And I thought a bit about that when I saw the list, and I mean, there are several ways of defining fragile states and environments. And I mean, one can question in the list that you use, Kenya and Rwanda are considered fragile, Colombia and Gaza are not. I mean, it also provokes some thoughts, like what are the, how relevant are these divisions, so to say. Also a bit on the framing and on the motivation. And also in the presentation here, we frame it as something new, both like increasingly working in fragile state and increasing risk appetite. Then I would also like to think a bit about like a longer time span, because if we start 2006, 7, 8, or like around 10, we know that we had a very, I would say, like a very specific political environment in Sweden, which is not, I would say that it's difficult to compare that to almost any other authorizing environment politically in Sweden. So what is new, and in comparison to what? Like if we use a bit of a larger time span. And I was thinking, while I read your report, I was, one of the days when I was reading it, I was also listening to this radio program of the Swedish secret support to the ANC and the liberation movement in South Africa. And I was thinking, this is super high risk and all the other supports to the liberation movements, as one example. Bai Bang, the huge investment, imagine that risk taking. So framing this newness in a longer time span. Then coming back to this, that also has to do with the scope and who is included and what kind of stakeholders that are included in this, and the way that accountability is framed in the study. Because as it is now, accountability is only related to home country, like the government of Sweden and the public of Sweden. There is no discussion on the accountability in regards to the target group. I mean, we don't have to talk about the governments but to the target group, that we are actually saying that we will aim to make this difference in the lives of these people. So that is also something that I found a bit surprising, because if we look at at the development agendas, we do push for we are also accountable to those that we're working with and for. And here accountability is used in a very strict sense of home, country, government, and public, if you may say so. And I also think that this has to do, and I think it was interesting in the presentation now where you put this the balance between the different risks. And I think it would have been interesting to see a bit more of that, the balance discussion, because now the risks are discussed either as one or separate, but not so much in relation to each other. And I think that comment that you made here on the presentation was really interesting, because I think the trade-off is that the institutional risks that also links to this accountability that we only take into account in the home country, while the other risks relates to the risk of not having the impact that we promise to try to achieve with the target group. So that kind of, and I think that Afghanistan is a great example of this. You pointed out in the study that in the strategy, the 5-year strategy, we say that we will not collaborate directly with the Afghan government. That has been slightly revised in discussion, but it's still in the strategy. And of course, that is due to almost a zero tolerance to risks within the institutional risks. But it also implies a huge acceptance of programmatic risks, because that means that we engage in a program that we know that there is a very, very high risk that we will not achieve the goals, the targets that we set to achieve. And I think looking at Afghanistan as a whole and over since 2001, all the investments and the huge flow of development cooperation that has gone into Afghanistan. And when most of donors left, as you pointed out, there is not a strong nation state. There is no there's no sense of justice and so on. And I mean, that is quite obvious that is what we will have if we keep on bypassing the state and creating parallel structure. So I would have liked to have seen that it's a trade-off, and we're buying, we're trading with the different risks, and that has to do with the power relationships and the different accountability forms that we include in this.
Thank you, Kajsa. So a little bit of questioning of the sort of framing and limitations of the study in terms of timelines, who are the risk stakeholders, and so on and so forth. And the authors will be given the opportunity to respond to this. Magnus, you have a bit of a distance now, I think, from all of this.
I do, but this was a very interesting read, and it was good to come back to a fairly dramatic period of Sida's history around 2010, 2011. But apart from that, I also think it's a well-timed report at the peer review release yesterday, the OECD DAC. I mean, the issue of working in fragility was a dominant theme, and the issues of risk and risk management will stay with development cooperation for a long period to come. And what I found particularly interesting in the report is how you have demonstrated how Sida's formalized risk management has responded to the external environment and what you call the authorizing environment. And from compliance and control to a somewhat higher risk appetite. And you also captured how that has tended to change roles and within the agency. Now, I'm not sure how much this waning influence of new public management really has contributed to this. I think that it takes longer time to trickle down into hardcore management issues and formalized management. For me, this is a fairly straightforward case. We had a hostile authorizing environment, and it was then replaced with a more conducive environment, relying more on the professional judgment of the development aid people in Sida. Now, just starting up with two minor reservations I have when I read the study. There is a fairly limited sample, and particularly a fairly limited sample of controllers in your study. And I think that makes you stretching the arguments perhaps a bit sometimes, and that does not say that you're not accurately describing the environment. I think you are. And secondly, I think the quantitative analysis is less persuasive than it could have been, partly because of the short time span, but I was thinking more in terms of that you ended 2017 and a new government coming in late 2014. Now, how could possibly that new government influence disbursement as early as 2017? Probably that is not, perhaps you can see it partly, but I don't think one should make too much of an argument on that. But, as you said in your presentation, we still have an untapped potential, and that could still be true. Whereas I don't think one should relate too much to the shift in government. You say in the beginning that this is an exploratory study, and as an exploratory study, I think it's very interesting, and I think there were a few things I would like to reflect on. One is that all of us have commented the programmatic versus and contextual versus institutional risks, and I think you're right. Yes, we are much more flexible when it comes to programmatic and contextual risks, which basically means that the risks we have easier to stomach risks to outcome than we have risks to even minor mismanagement of funds, which means that in terms of accountability, we accept accountability, our domestic accountability much more than we would accept the accountability to the target group. And I think you are right in pointing that out, and we need to reflect much more than we do on the trade-offs. And I think your suggestion of nuancing the never accept approach and discussing it and challenging that a bit, I think that is welcome, and it's something that we certainly would need to talk more about, both from an accountability perspective, but also from a flexibility perspective. But, and my second point is,
second and final point.
As long as this is not translated into strategy level, as long as government is not explicitly instructing Sida to have a risk appetite and work flexibly, that will not happen. The strategy level has to accompany whatever fluffy things you have in the policy framework. It is the strategy that counts, and unless and until it's reflected in the strategy, it won't happen. And that is why I liked your idea of actually having discussing risk on a portfolio level, making sure that you can actually see various risk levels on a portfolio level. High risk, high return, low risk, perhaps a bit duller, but certain returns. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Magnus. We have 25 more minutes, and I imagine that there will be questions and comments from the floor. But I still like to ask, Nilima, could you just very briefly comment? You don't have to respond to everything, and then we'll have a final round also. Would you like to do that?
Quickly do that.
Yeah.
Thank you.
If you join, Magnus maybe over there, yeah.
So first of all, thank you very much for some considered and very reflective comments. I kind of wish this was still a draft and I could go back and try and do a few things to accommodate them, which I can't at this point, but I'll try and briefly address maybe one comment from each of you. So the first is this idea that a never accept approach to corruption that Hans raised might actually be the backdrop for greater flexibility. And I think you gave the example of the Gold Spade Award for the person who found the most corruption in Sida and rewarding that. What's really interesting is that did not come up in our interviews. And notwithstanding some of the limitations of the amount and so on, I think we spoke to 29 people out of a total of 56 that we had approached. People were not talking about the internal kind of incentives to find corruption. People were talking about more the fear, particularly for the program managers who are now taking on greater burdens of responsibility, who feel there is a need for more guidance. So to your second point about a standard, that I think came from people who, at the coal face, who feeling the heat, perhaps not having a head of unit willing to back them up in the same way that some might. That was very kind of, very much at the coal face. So I just would be curious to look, how does this look from the bottom up? In terms of the limitations, Kasia, on the focus on donor-centered and not so much focused on the receiving end. The intention was always to limit the scope of the study to Sida officials, and the introduction of the contribution analysis came at a later stage where there was a desire to see it in action, if you will. But the intention, and it's a rightful criticism, but the intention was, given the scope and scale of the study in place, that receiving end was perhaps not as developed as it could be. And what's interesting, though, is in terms of the lived experience of the people we did talk to, accountability upwards was more often referenced than accountability, let's say, downwards. Okay, so I think it comes from also the empirical material that we had, not just the limitations of the study, and we have to recognize that differential prioritization, even though you might say that accountability is very important, and I would agree with you on that. So I think there are many others I could respond to, but I'm not going to do that here. And then lastly, so your reservation about the sampling I wanted to address. So like I said, we had spoken to 29 out of 56, and we did get less than ideal take-up for those we would broadly put in the box of compliance-focused functions. Now, there might be a variety of reasons for that, but I think it is empirically potentially significant, and we suggest as much. And it might go back to the point that we didn't raise so much in the presentation, but is in the report, about the changing intra-organizational relationships between program managers, heads of unit, and controllers. And so it might be suggested of some concern around that. It was still very early days in track 2, but there might be other reasons for that. And your point about the quantitative analysis, I couldn't agree more about data lags, which is why all we end up saying is there's untapped potential, as opposed to this is reflective of something that shouldn't be right. But yeah.
Great. Thank you very much, Nilima. And please remain, and we'll open the floor for questions and comments. Please, towards the end. Yes. And please introduce yourself.
Yes, hi, thank you. I'm Henrik Fermark from ACT Church of Sweden, working as a humanitarian policy advisor. And thanks for this report. I think it's such an important discussion to have. And as an NGO, international NGO with a lot of local partners, we're sort of in the middle of this discussion on risks. And I'm so happy that you mentioned this, Kaisa, in your comment, the upward accountability that we're discussing here, and the risk that we identify on this level, where we try to mitigate that with the risks that actually are mentioned by the target communities or the survivor communities, because those are the risks that we need to sort of address. And as an NGO, together with our local partners, we will always try to find the means to cover that risks and be accountable upwards at the same time, downwards. and it will always be like that, I guess. The question is, which I think is important, because I do agree that this is our assumption as well, that there is an increased risk appetite also from back donors. But I would like to ask, in relation with that chart of funding flows, which was presented in your presentation, Nilima, which I think is so important, because I have a feeling that this risk appetite is centered in pilot projects, in smaller scale projects where we can be a bit more take a bit more risks because we're testing something. But the big chunk of project and money will more and more be allocated to multinationals who are not that risk aware and who are not forwarding the localization agenda, etc., etc. So my question is, how do we move from this pilot project dilemma where we do take risk, where we do find exciting ways of being effective and doing really good things, with this mainstream approach within the systems that doesn't really seem to change? So there's a huge gap, I think, between policy, where we do all agree, and practice. So how do we address that?
Thanks. Let's take one more. Yeah.
Leif Newman from the Swedish Society for Nature Conservation. Thanks for a very, very interesting report. And I think, as someone mentioned, mentioning the elephant in the room, I think as civil society organizations, we've had this dialogue for quite some time with Sida about risk-taking and the completely no-go when it comes to corruption cases, and also the issue of risk-taking there, and that the risk always falls on the one that has been subcontracted, for instance, in the case us. And I think that somehow inhibits us, even though there is flexibility and risk-taking when it comes to programmatic areas. And I would just be interested to hear, maybe from Sida, how you plan to take this report forward. Is there any kind of internal debate that you foresee coming as a result of this, and so forth? But most of all, thanks for bringing this up. I think it's really helpful.
Thanks. So let's begin with those two. Nilima, would you like to start the first one on how do we go from what is now sort of general policy and talk to actually practicing this and reaching the final mile and making real the whole notion of localization? How will it happen? It hasn't happened yet.
Yeah, a big agenda item. I mean, my instinctive response, I don't know empirically whether we could show it was purely, that the incentives were for pilot projects as opposed to bilateral, longer-term bilateral funding. But I think what we did find in the portfolio analysis, it's a big chunk going to multilaterals. And multilaterals are investments, particularly earmarked multilateral joint pooled funds, is a way of risk sharing. Particularly in fragile and conflict-affected states. And I think at the heart of your question is really a question for the Swedish government in terms of the balance it wants to strike between its multilateral engagement, writ large across its portfolio, and then within the kind of fragility agenda versus a bilateral approach. But multilaterals are seen to be a way of sharing and pooling risk in environments where a single donor doesn't feel comfortable engaging with. I think the finding that struck me the most is the decline in the engagement with local civil society. That one I think really stood out as potentially something that could be shifted given, I think, a different authorizing environment now. But I think at the heart of this are some broader questions about how Sweden wants to engage multilaterally versus bilaterally.
Thanks. And then we'll ask Sida, and Hans, you'll have to be Sida today. So the second question.
I'll be tomorrow too.
Okay, great. The fiduciary, the elephant in the room. There's a very provocative quotation from a civil society representative in the report saying something like, Sida is more concerned about its money than our lives. We risk our lives, but you're more concerned about taxpayers' money. So you don't have to respond to that, but it's clearly something strongly felt, and I don't think don't take it personally. But so the question was, how does Sida take this further? This analysis that has been now provided.
No, I think this is really important to say that we are sort of starting a journey. I mean, it takes, as Maria says, it takes time for changes in policy to reach the fruits or the feet of organization. But I think that one thing that we need to do is actually talk more about the results, the positive results that we get when we go local, and that will, in per se, give everyone more courage to take the risks. I think that's very important. We have started to discuss that, but it's still sort of very incipient. We can do more. And I think this is sort of the dialogue on risks and results of how we will do it. That we need to make that public and need to sort of open in Sweden, but also internally make it really a discussion that works and will get that.
So this is the communication part that's so much emphasized by
And the other part is which we actually sort of are really incipient in actually working incrementally, and that it's a lot related to our capacity as an organization, our limited administrative resources compared with the huge amount of funding that we disperse, and we need to, if we want to work incrementally, we need more staff. And the third thing I think is, which is related to the strategy, it's not only talk about risk and strategies, but it's really important to see what kind of objectives do we put in the strategies, because depending on that we will work in different ways. And if the objective is to strengthen local organizations, then that would be what we would do, of course. And I think that's really important also to be clear on it. The objectives we get in the strategies are really important for steering us how we work.
Yeah. So bringing it back to the strategic level and the government's responsibilities and instructions to see that.
And at the same time, that working incrementally at the local level, how we do things in the ground is really important too.
Yeah. A new question? Yeah, Carl-Anders.
Thank you. Oh.
Yeah. Yes, my name is Carl-Anders Larsson. I've been working for Sida for a long time, but now retired. And I was very happy to hear about this increased risk appetite. That's what I've been waiting for a long time. But I was not really convinced still that it's a lot talk, but what about reality? And the important issue, of course, here, as you said, is the government. And I was a bit surprised. You haven't at all talked to the government in this study. And after all, that's where the important decisions are taken about the strategies and policies. And I still think there is a lot of risk aversion in the government, especially on the political risks. So maybe that is the next step. You have to bring this to the government.
Yeah, maybe I can offer a comment. There were actually efforts made to talk to the government, but it turned out that for reasons unknown to us, it didn't happen.
We managed to talk, I mean, depending what you mean by government, do you mean the political, or do you mean the various ministries and bodies? So various ministries and bodies we did. So you could know better than I would, but the MFA, we spoke to the audit office, FBA. So we did try and engage. We didn't engage so much with the political space.
No. But obviously this is a very important observation that needs to happen. Who? End of the room?
Thank you. My name is Malena Rembe and I work for Kvinna till Kvinna. But I previously also worked in Afghanistan and the Middle East for a number of years. So if I understand, you say that the risk appetite is growing, and that's positive. and it is particularly the programmatic and contextual risk appetite that is growing. But at the same time, duty of care is very strong within Sida, perhaps almost with a zero tolerance to risk towards the staff. So how then, or did you hear anyone discuss how to parallel the risk appetite, which is down in the field, with the need to monitor more closely? Because my experience from my years in the field is that Sida staff tend to come and monitor the same programs over and over again because they are in what is considered safe locations. While the majority of the work that we're doing is done in very unsafe locations. So how to make sure that the monitoring and the accountability, the quality control of impact is still met when you have a higher risk appetite? And was this something that came up in the discussions? That's my question.
Thank you. We'll take one more. Yep, here, please.
Hi, my name is Mohammed Reza. I was interning at Sida, and my question is that what is the acceptable level of risk management? That we just say that no, it's very high risk, we cannot take it.
Thank you. So I'll ask, I think, both Nilima and Hans to comment on this, because Nilima, it's about what have you observed, but also I think, Hans, how do you in practice realize this? How do you do your monitoring in the most difficult and risky environments? But Nilima, would you like to say something on that?
I mean, we only looked at one contribution, but it did come up. And it came up in the context of where controllers should sit in particular, because they obviously play a kind of monitoring function, and under track 2, a continuous monitoring function. And in the context of Afghanistan, those controllers sit in Stockholm. And security risks being what they were, that decision was taken to keep them there. And I mean, there was some concern that choice hamstrung a little bit the ability to convince those people that some of these risks, for pragmatic reasons, had to be taken. So this question of where controllers should sit came up in the context of that one contribution. But Hans might have more broader view of how to decentralize that function in the context of...
No, I think that observation is very, very correct, but I think it's, there is, duty of care, if we put that, is something that actually has been growing by itself in various ways. And I think that if we look back on how we used to work in Afghanistan, for example, there is sort of a tendency to work a lot more with security within the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and in Sida. And I think this is something that limits us, and that what we have seen more and more. And now we are trying to, within an internal project, actually trying to see how can we, having this development in the security thinking, still improve our monitoring capacity. And this is something that's really, really tricky. But we have, it's not, we don't have the solution, but we are working actively on this issue. And I think that's, we see the same problem as you mentioned. And we try to see how can we attend to that. And of course, that implies that we need to use a lot of different methods to be able to do the monitoring in places where it's really, really unsecure. And I think that if we talk about the what risk level is acceptable, I think it actually very much, it depends very much on different contexts. And that's where I think that we want it to be. And that's why I think it's really, really difficult to say this is sort of the standard. Because I think that depending on how the context is and the sort of combination of risks is really important to take with you when you look upon it. So I think it's really hard to answer. But at the same time, I think maybe we should be better in giving that level of acceptance.
Thank you. We have one more question, then I'll give the panel a chance to give a final comment. But please, yes.
Yes. Thank you very much. My name is Petter Bolme. I'm here to write an article for Omvärlden. My question is, when you're talking about now the fiduciary risks, what is acceptable in these risks to take? You took the example of Afghanistan, but I mean, these are risks wherever you ask. I mean, is it to paying security guards on the street that you can't give a guard, a taxi driver who's not giving a receipt? Where do you draw the line of where the actual risk of fiduciary, the corruption, where bad kind of a reporting or bad reporting, or somebody actually taking too much money and not paying? Where do you draw that line?
Yeah, thanks, Nilima. I think that there's some very detailed reasoning around exactly this issue in the report.
I didn't have time to get into it, and I think it ties in nicely to the question about this acceptable level of risk, the kind of broader question. We offer a few ideas in the report, and I mean, I don't think you can come up with a number. I don't think you can say 80%. I think it is very specific to the context that you're working in and the particular nature of the contribution in question. All I would say is that whatever that level is, you need to think about both the accountability for the risks that are run and the importance of being adapted and flexible, and consider the balance. It's never going to be 50-50, but you need to think about those two. But in the context of fiduciary risk and what is acceptable, we suggest one idea, which is maybe making a distinction between the deliberate misuse of funds, so embezzlement and fraud, as opposed to what you might call facilitation payments to be able to allow Sida to carry out its mandate. But I suspect that's also quite controversial as a concept to make that distinction. But thinking about what a good enough approach to anti-corruption is, as opposed to the best approach to anti-corruption, might be one way. So from a never accept to a good enough kind of approach, which suggests maybe a more incrementalist or muddling through kind of strategy. But I would hesitate to put a percentage on that. So, yeah.
And of course, this is one of the most delicate of all topics. You cannot allow yourself to be accused of accepting corruption. So how do you communicate that? Thank you very much for questions and comments, and thank you to Linnea and Nilima. Now I'll give the panel, and Hans was very much yes, you were very much in the firing line here. I think maybe naturally, because the focus was so much on Sida. So we'll ask Kajsa and Magnus to, unless you want to.
No, it's fine.
Yeah, Kajsa.
Yes, a year ago, or a bit less than a year ago, I was in the board of Sida for a bit more than 2 years, and in the annually we had a discussion on the annual report of Sida, which had, and I think it still has, a traffic light system about how the different strategies, how they've turned out, how it's gone during the last year. And if you looked at all those traffic lights, there was almost always a red or orange light in the conflict, in the fragile state and the conflict countries. And I think that every time that we discuss those traffic lights, I said, but it's really strange, because it's not about, it shouldn't be about risk management, because we should be capable of working in the environments where we set ourselves to work. And the conflict and the deep poverty and the injustice, those are the reasons why we're there, and at the same time we're giving them as a reason why we're failing our strategies. So I think that, and I thought a bit about that discussion that we had repeatedly in the board on that kind of, what is this about? And I thought about that also when I read your study, and I think that comes out very nicely in the example that you have from Afghanistan, that the risk was mitigated through a deep contextual knowledge that was held by the local staff. And I think that is something that we really should take with us as well, to the Home Office, to our organizations and so on, the importance of that really deep contextual thematic knowledge and how we save that, how we build that. And I think that that is something that is lacking. I had the opportunity to prepare a presentation of Swedish aid with Lennart Båge, who was for a short time the director of Sida, but who's been involved in Swedish and international development cooperation for a long time. And he pointed out that like the knowledge, like the deep knowledge, how do we secure that? And I think that that comes out as something really important. And this is an explorative study, and I think that that is something that would be really interesting to look into, like more on the knowledge, the content side.
Thank you. Magnus?
And that knowledge will require a field presence, and field presence costs money. And so there is also a trade-off, and we're talking about many trade-offs here, but there is also a trade-off between field presence and the actual risk management you can do on the ground. And perhaps a teaser then, there is a EBA study coming on the admin costs versus the development appropriation. I think the issue of trade-off between flexibility and accountability is basically a question of accountability to whom. Are we talking about accountability upwards, or are we talking about accountability downwards to the target group and the people for whom we are set to serve? And unless and until that trade-off is somehow reflected in the directives Sida get, this will be fluffy talk and not action. Thank you.
On that note, I think it's a very good note to end on. And I think what Hans has said a couple of times here, that we have to approach this in an incremental way, meaning that this is very much work in progress, where we have to feel our way forward. And I think, and we hope that this study has actually contributed substantially to that work, which is now in progress. So we thank the authors and the panelists for your brilliant presentation and comments today. And I'll give you one more teaser before we end, in addition to the one that Magnus presented. Namely, you don't have to wait long for the next EBA event. This happens already next week on 18th June, when we have quite a unique presentation of 2 long-term studies on Swedish aid to Cambodia. So you'll get 2 for the price of 1. I think Carl-Anders will be in focus here. So please register and come back, and you're most welcome also here, I think, on the 18th of June. Thank you very much, and have a safe bicycle ride trip back home. Thank you.